There are 200,000 farmers in Canada. Let's dig into their problems. Welcome to the Hands That Feed Us on tour. I'm Devin Cook, and I'm driving across Canada to find romance. But not the kind you think. I'm looking for the romance, the big ideas, the ambition, and the sheer bloody-mindedness that can rebuild Canada's economy. Today, I'm back in Daysland, Alberta, where I spent a month filming with Nathan Eschpeter in 2020. I'm speaking with Nathan's father, Ken, who has made a retirement project of making sure the small town he lives in doesn't die out.
I have this feeling that within the confines of many parts of rural Alberta, we are kind of sitting on a thin edge. We need to be able to maintain a viable rural population. In order to do that, we need to entice people to come back to the farm. And I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think the carrots that we're holding out to people to entice them to become farmers are perhaps quite doing the job that we would hope. Plus, it seems a little bit of a peculiar situation in that some of the folk that feel they want to farm the whole province. And so that makes it really difficult for entry-level people. And that's going to come up and be in part of the discussion tonight.
Tell me why rural revitalization is such an important issue for you.
I've only been thinking about this for about 40 years, so hopefully I have a reasonable response to that. My good wife and I moved to Daysland to start farming in 1979, and Daysland keeps losing viability. Everyone has been convinced that they need to go to some bigger center to shop at the bigger stores, and as a result of that, it's having a very negative consequence on business in the little towns. The opportunity for it to become big and viable like it was 40 years ago was remote. When I started grade 1 in the Strome School, there were 27 of us in grade 1. I think in grade 1 in Strome now there's none, but had they had the opportunity to continue going there, there would be nobody left there. This loss of vitality in terms of people who want to live in little towns happens so slowly that a lot of times we don't notice the impact that is occurring until maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years later, and we look around and we say, gee, where did the vitality go? Camrose, Alberta has been experiencing the opposite of what our smaller towns have been experiencing. However, it has prospered in a way that I don't like. It's all the big box stores, and it just continues to have a larger and larger negative impact on things that are going on in the rural area. So I'll stop there.
I'm sure this is a familiar issue. I mean, what you haven't had the opportunity to do is talk about it in a bigger group. And I want to frame this a little bit. When I say I want to rebuild Canada's economy, that means starting from the grassroots, because we have built an economy before and somehow built all of these little towns that are at risk of disappearing. So I want to rebuild our local banks, our local distributors, our local grocery stores. So how do we bring people back and have those local owners? That's a question for you, Ken. Do you have some ideas about that?
You didn't say I was going to have to answer these kinds of questions. The answer would be yes, I do. There are things we can begin doing. The first issue is help people realize the seriousness of what is going on. As we're speaking, I have decided that there are some things that we need to address. Cities' goals are in no way, shape, or form similar to goals of people who live in smaller communities. And as long as we support monopolies and capitalism with the new definition of capitalism in the last 20 years, I'll tell you, it is going to be one incredibly rough and rocky road to try to have smaller areas survive. So if there's anybody here that would be prepared to, mount a pushback from the rural area. We're about 20 years late. But this is very serious stuff. You think you're going to get a Canadian Tire store to come to Daysland as an example? I mean, we still do have home hardware stores. That's a pretty amazing thing. As far as I know, they're the only business in Canada that is prepared to search around a little bit for other places to do business. But if this scenario continues, I simply do not know how we're going to maintain the viability of smaller communities or the little town that they're from.
I crossed the country, and at the end of my journey, I sort of had to sort of think about it and go, well, what would be a viable farm for me? And the only one that seemed viable for me is the first one, Amara Farm, 2.5 acres. That was the only one that I saw that me, as an outsider, as a non-farmer, that's the only one I could wrap my head around in terms of financial risk. What could I buy into? Could I get that amount of land? 2.5 acres feels very achievable. So I guess where I want this to go is, you've been doing a lot of thinking about, well, how do we bring more young people into Daysland? What would Amara Farm look like if it were here? Because it couldn't look the same.
Well, it would require irrigation, that's for sure. People have different expectations. I have an expectation, and I think a number of folk here would concur, that I would like to see Daysland stay viable and become more viable. There are all kinds of things happening in the confines of the economy that would suggest there's an awful lot of people don't give a flying rat's ass about Daysland. But I think one of the things we would need to do is form think tanks and take a look at issues that are affecting the rural areas in very negative ways, so that when we created an attack, so to speak, or a reason to be against a particular policy, we would know precisely what that is. And it would behoove us to know what is causing some of the things that we see on a daily basis around us. And then after a certain number of days of driving by it, we begin to accept it as the norm, and we don't even fight anymore.
I wonder, have you done any work or research with a group called the Young Agrarians? Okay, so you've kind of idealized that small market garden kind of idea on the island. I know I have a cousin that did that. Is that something that you see as a viable option here on the prairies?
This is kind of what I was trying to ask Ken. It would have to look very different. What I would say is, when I was up in the Peace, which is also it's quite far from urban centers, but I found a bunch of people doing direct-to-market meat production. And actually, I had a screening in Sexsmith, Alberta, where the only farmer in the room that did not have a second job was selling small-scale meats direct to consumer. Everyone else in that room was doing something else in addition to the large-scale farming. So I do think that it can be applied in a place like this, but it looks completely different from what we have now. I think that's sort of our task for this evening, is to try and find a romantic vision of what that could be. Because I don't think this 250,000 acre farm is going to get us that vibrant rural community.
When I look around, I don't see a whole lot of young people.
No.
From 1,000 miles up looking down, okay, I think the people like our age maybe can do the education for the young people. And they're going to have ideas that we don't even think about. And they'll have solutions. The other part of my point was, yes, farming is important, but also there's other businesses that can be equally as important. If you're going to buy clothes, electronics repair, something like that, any of that kind of stuff, where do you go? Big box stores, maybe? So it's more than just farming.
The name Young Agrarians was mentioned.
Yes.
They started up, I think, in 2016. I think they're all across Canada. They spent a weekend on our farm, and the common denominator was they have a passion to learn how to raise and grow food, However, they don't have any money. So lots of people retiring, and it wouldn't be possible for a farm to say, here's 5 acres, feed us. We don't give a darn if we get any money. That's what you do at a think tank. But you know what? The people at think tanks aren't the young agrarians. They're doing their own thinking. And we have to learn from them because they have that passion. And the flame is getting very, very low because as we age, if they can't succeed, who's going to grow our food?
A really important part of this is that succession thing. And as you say, you can set aside 5 acres and give that young person a start. I think that is how that renewal has to happen. If you just wait to pass it on and you're kind of abandoning your land to the logic of finance. So I guess in talking to the elders in this community, think about how you can pass your passion, your romance, as well as your resources on to the next generation, because that next generation needs resources. And so I do want to bring this back to young agrarians, because this is a service that young agrarians specifically provides, is they match older farmers that are looking to have their farm continue with young farmers that are landless. They are not big enough. There is such a need for this, and they can do less than 100 of these every year. But they are trying, and they're doing excellent work, and they are passing it on to the next generation.
I think, first of all, you have to develop an awareness, teach the younger people an awareness of the value of living in rural Alberta. And not just farming, but in the communities.
In the community, yeah.
And so you have to make them aware that by going to Costco and going to Walmart, they are having a negative impact.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility as older people to teach them that. Why would they come out here if they don't even know it exists? So we need to be responsible to make them aware of the value of living in rural Alberta.
I know that this subject matter is not a simple thing. We've been watching the vitality of rural areas dwindle for the last 40 years, and we're not going to snap a finger and cause a huge turnaround in potential viability. But I know I'm not the only person that thinks it's a good thing to start talking about again or thinking about. There are things that we can do, but I also know that there's a couple of huge issues that we would have to overcome. So I hope this is the beginning of a process.
Yeah, I think we should wrap it up. I guess I'll try and close with the idea that there's a spark here, bring it to your young people.
Thanks for listening to the Hands That Feed Us on tour. My goal for the tour is to host 250 discussions in rural agricultural communities across Canada. That's one every weekday. The tour is possible because of word of mouth. My offer is this: if you have a barn or a basement anywhere in Canada, I will personally come to your community, host a screening of my documentary, The Hands That Feed Us, and facilitate a discussion. All you have to do is invite your friends and neighbors. If you know someone who might want to bring my tour to town, send them a link to this episode, or get them to sign up at thehandsthatfeedus.ca/host. There's a link in the episode description. Next week, I visit Prairie Garden Seeds in Saskatchewan and talk to Rochelle Tournier about how hard it is to go it alone as a young single farmer.